Thank you for joining this webinar on priorities to improve messages about the healthfulness of carbohydrate food sources. This is a webinar sponsored by the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, or IFANS for short. I am Barbara Lyle, the moderator for this webinar. My disclosures for the past 36 months are shown on this slide. I am a consulting advisor to the IFANS Carbohydrate Committee, who is the sponsor of both this webinar as well as the research that you will see presented today. IFANS is a nonprofit organization focused on advancing food and nutrition science. We are guided by our core values of scientific integrity that are centered on transparency, collaboration, and public benefit. This is done by bringing together our members from government, industry, and academia to identify areas of common interest and develop projects to advance science in those areas. As an organization, IFANS funds research and convenes experts to deliver a variety of products to include competitively funded research, workshops, dialogues, and related peer-reviewed publications as examples. We have two priorities today for this webinar. The first is to address priorities for messaging with consumers, where the priorities are based on misalignments between what consumers believe about foods containing carbohydrates and how food rating systems rank these same foods, with the latter being an indicator of how experts are advising our consumers. Food rating systems reflect expert advice within the broad context of dietary guidance, which includes nutrients, nutrient density, but also includes options consistent with limiting saturated fat, added sugar, sodium, increasing whole grains, managing energy intake, each giving their own weight in the algorithms to which of those components are included, as well as the weight of how much each of those components affects the final rating for a food. So this leads us to the second priority, which is to improve alignment between these food rating systems. So when we talk in this webinar about expert advice, what we're referring to is not really individual people, but rather how expert advice is reflected in the tools applied to inform consumers. And in our case, it's specifically food rating systems. So confusing and conflicting advice between these food rating systems will fuel consumer distrust and can lead to broadly restricting carbohydrate foods, even those that are contributing to a healthful dietary pattern. There are 4 talks in this webinar. All 4 of them presenting research-based evidence that will inform then the important panel discussion at the end of the webinar, in which we pull everything together and we talk about the top priorities for improving messages about the healthfulness of carbohydrate foods. The first talk reports on consumer research. So you can agree or disagree as an expert, but this is what consumers are telling us. The second talk introduces a tool that's available for comparing how commonly consumed foods, including carbohydrate foods, are ranked in a few representative food rating systems. Related to that is a third talk that briefly shows how that tool can actually be applied and used to compare foods based on their overall healthfulness. The fourth talk presentation directly addresses the priorities. So they will be based on, first, the misalignment between what consumers are telling us they believe and the food rating systems, which again are a reflection of expert advice. So just keep remembering that when we say expert advice, what we're referring to are the food rating systems that are developed by experts. We didn't go out and survey what experts said. We looked at how they were translated into these food rating systems. The second part of talk number 4 is going to address priorities for improving the alignment of how foods are rated between these 5 food rating systems. So if experts aren't aligned, then advice to consumer adds to confusion and mistrust. So given these new research insights from those first 4 talks, we're going to conclude with actionable outcomes by discussing priorities. Our speakers are being joined by two internationally respected experts on the quality of carbohydrate foods. They are Doctors Adam Drunowski and Joanne Slavin, who will introduce themselves at the start of the discussion on priorities. Importantly, before we kick off this webinar, I want to state that when we started this project, we were seeking to understand how to communicate with consumers about the quality of carbohydrate foods from a human health perspective. But early on in our consumer research, it was apparent that carbohydrate quality as a term was not really recognized or didn't resonate as a description with consumers in the US. So you're going to learn about that from Elisa in that first talk. Also, as for describing foods as healthy, this research avoids using dichotomous labels indicating a food is either healthy or unhealthy for two reasons. First, foods are on a continuum of how they contribute to overall healthy diet patterns. And second, healthy is a regulated claim defined by the Food and Drug Administration for use in foods in the US. So keep in mind, this research is not about labeling foods as healthy, but rather it's within the context of a continuum of less to more healthful food choices in relative terms. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, please click on the question mark tab at the top of your panel and enter your question in the box. Those questions are only visible to the IFIN staff, and I will do my best to consolidate them and address them with each of the speakers as they give each of their talks. At this point, we're ready for our first presentation.
Thank you, and hi, this is Elisa Ghirardelli. I am a principal research scientist with NORC at the University of Chicago, and I'm here to talk about some research that we conducted with IFENS, looking at the quality of carbohydrates, beliefs, and behaviors among consumers to better understand what they know, what they don't know, as well as what might work for them in the future for communication strategies. So we know that consumers are exposed to many different sources of information on food and nutrition, and specifically carbohydrates. And this is very challenging for consumers to know what kinds of things they should be eating or where they need to go for information. So these create challenges among consumers. Nutrition facts label includes carbohydrates, and the FDA does have information about how to read the nutrition facts label and how much is needed each day. However, from our research, we found that from our respondents in our phase 1, that information about carbohydrates that they're getting is mostly from social media or through internet sources. And we found that many of them are not trusting government sources about carbohydrates and other kinds of nutrition information. The other thing is that the USDA Dietary Guidelines Food and Nutrition Information Center has little information on carbohydrates. So other than the statement below about the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine and the academies having the dietary reference intakes, as well as the information about different macronutrients, there's really no information about carbohydrates other than things in the footnotes of content areas or in a table. Also, when you go to the USDA Food and Nutrition Information Center, it sends you back to the dietary guidelines, the DRIs, and My Plate, which do not have much information at all about carbohydrates. USDA My Plate doesn't include carbohydrates or any explanation of which foods include carbohydrates. And other sources have information on carbohydrates, but the focus is on sugars and grains and less on fruits and vegetables. Project, IFIN sought to consider the alignment between carbohydrate foods that experts are not aligned on in terms of their consumer ratings and healthfulness, but also to explore the consumer certainty on the assignment of foods to that category of carbohydrates, and to also think about messages on message platforms that would be related to the quality of carbohydrate foods with consumers, and to think about what their trade-offs are in decision making among consumers when they're choosing carbohydrate foods, and for parents to help think about their children and making healthy choices and teaching them how to do that. So this research started with a phase 1 that was a very exploratory phase where we wanted to understand consumer terminology and views about the quality of foods with carbohydrates. And then we convened an expert group, and that moved us into the second phase, which was when we focused on understanding from consumers how they decide if a food contains carbohydrates and any of those trade-offs that they make when selecting foods. And then we also tested some initial ideas for message platforms, which were explored in the research. So to do this, following our IRB approval, we used market research data to target audiences via social media and advertising. So these were to bring in individuals that were known to purchase foods, healthy foods, supplements, and those that had interest in nutrition topics. So for screening into phase 1, we had about 1,300 responses, and then over 1,400 for phase 2. These were both convenient samples, and we screened for being over 18 or over. And then we also screened out for supplement or nutrition industry background. And then we also balanced demographically and geographically so that we ensured diversity across the groups. And we conducted these online with about 8 to 10 respondents for 4 groups in each phase. So in phase 1, we asked consumers to take the terms that they used to describe carbohydrates to consider where they would place them on one side or another of a whiteboard in terms of their quality. So we had lower quality foods and concepts that were on the left side of the board, and higher quality foods went to the right. And then we asked about what might land in the middle, or which foods that respondents struggled to place on either side of the board. So this is just an example of one of the boards that we included in our findings of the research. And you can see that there are things that usually are considered lower quality, sodas and chips and French fries and chocolate and other kinds of sweets ended up on the lower quality side. And there was some confusion about things like Slim Jims. And then also on the higher quality side, we had lentils or complex carbohydrates and beans, oats and barley, fruits. Bananas and oranges were specifically named, as well as whole grains, fibers, and then we did have veggies over there on the right side. But there were a lot of foods that landed in the middle, such as rice, bread, potatoes, cereal, pasta, and milk. So when we asked respondents to consider what didn't fit into the lower or the higher quality assignments of the foods, we really focused on some of these foods that we wanted to understand better. So in the following slides, you'll see when it was higher quality versus lower quality, all of these foods were included in higher and lower. So you can see that we had potato and bread and pasta and rice and air pop popcorn that were in higher quality, that were considered foods to eat, that were carbohydrate foods. And then in lower quality, we also saw potato, dairy and milk, cereal, bread and pasta, rice and popcorn. So these kinds of gave us some indicators of which foods we might want to test and better understand why they're sort of in the middle, or also seen as lower or higher quality foods, and to dig into those a little bit more in the phase 2 research. So also in the phase 2 research, we wanted to understand how consumers decide if a food has carbohydrates. And so we asked them to write down what makes a food rich in carbohydrates and then to reveal it to the camera. So this would give us top of mind responses. And you could see that sugars and starches and the amount of sugar and the amount of carbohydrate, if it's a grain or a whole grain, and if it's on the nutrition facts label or on the ingredients list, that will give you, those are the sort of top of mind responses that we heard from respondents. We also then conducted a poll during our sessions, and in that live poll, we gave them responses to actually be able to select. So we included an introduction that says, I know which foods have carbohydrates. If they are starches, have added sugars or sweetened with sugars, or their grains or cereals, or it says so on the nutrition facts label. But fiber and fruits and vegetables and beans and legumes kind of landed on the bottom of the list for where people were thinking about deciding if a food has carbohydrates. So for the next few slides, you can see some of the responses that we heard from the attendees to the focus groups. We heard that all nutrition things are tricky to put into words, and carbs are on the nutrition facts label, but they really didn't understand what they were. And that fruits and vegetables have carbs, but most of the time they don't have any labels, so we really don't understand. Carbs are not just grains, they're other foods. In the pyramid, which is an older version of my plate, that needed to be taken into account so that saying a statement encapsulates what a carb is challenging. We also heard that it's hard because there are differing levels of carbohydrates due to a glycemic index and the ratio of fibers. So it depends on quality, which depends on processed versus unprocessed foods. We've also been heavily marketed to think that carbs are bad. So it's to think of it in another way it's easy to be deceived. Unique eating styles, habits, needs. So saying any statements about carbs are hard because it won't pertain to everyone. So we heard a lot of different things about deciding if foods have carbohydrates and why it's challenging to do that and to understand when to choose carbohydrate foods. So we also explored in the phase 2 research trade-offs and making choices about foods with carbohydrates. And so we learned that consumers are making many trade-offs, and they're challenged by a lot of different choices in their decision-making process. They do want to balance their nutrition, but they struggle with many decisions related to processing, taste, satiety, and the kinds of activities that they're involved in. We also wanted to test some ideas for message framing or platforms, but we weren't able to reach a consensus on a unifying message. We did find out that consumers are concerned with added sugars more than fats or sodium, and this would align with what we see in the media and in the information that's available online. They responded positively to messaging about identifying foods with carbohydrates to eat more of if they have fiber, if they're fruits or vegetables, beans or legumes, or whole grains. But these were not on the top of the list when we asked them, how do you decide if a food is a carbohydrate? They also reacted positively to the idea of having healthy carbohydrates being plain foods without other added ingredients. So then we also conducted a live poll to capture their thoughts collectively using some response options and asked about their trade-offs when making these decisions. And so then actually it flipped where it said, I eat foods with carbohydrates based on if they're fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, or whole grains, how processed they are, if they have healthy nutrients, and if they affect my health outcomes. So after talking about a lot of these ideas, the fruits and vegetables, beans, legumes ended up at the top of what they were thinking about in terms of their trade-offs. So the findings from the qualitative methods in phase 2 and in phase 1 indicated that there's some consumer confusion about carbohydrate-rich foods, as well as their healthfulness. Consumers were selected because of their tendency to have interest in making healthy food choices. And so we didn't include individuals that didn't really have interest in being active consumers. Because we knew then they would struggle with the conversations that we were having. So these were consumers that were more likely to take interest in making healthy decisions. But we did learn that they make choices based on reading the food label and generally care about their health and nutrition. And they're also exposed to a variety of messages and information about food. The greatest amount of confusion that we learned in phase 1, as well as in phase 2, and some of the deeper dives that we conducted, were that pasta, breads, potatoes, alternative milks, all are challenging for understanding where those fit on the scale of healthfulness, if they're healthy versus unhealthy. And we heard a lot of that depends on what you add to it and how it's been processed. We also heard that consistently people thought that oatmeal was healthy, but they also thought that sports drinks were healthy too. We also wanted to understand more on their thoughts on how they decide if a food includes carbohydrates. And there appears to be some confusion as to how they make that assessment. They do seek guidance about carbohydrates in general, but we did learn from phase 1 that that's mostly through social media. Most admit to confusion, and very few are clear in their assessment. Most of the time, they don't view fruits and vegetables as foods with carbohydrates. They do decide if foods have carbohydrates mainly based on how much sugar they have or if they're starches. So we feel like there are some next steps that we could take here, and we could capture more details about the trusted sources of information and the media channels that are being most used for health information and the pathways that are followed to actual accurate information. Also, understanding insights from consumers on other factors that contribute to their knowledge about carbohydrates could be important. So understanding what we're seeing in other consumer surveys, as well as reviewing data about the time span related to the expansion on any access to information. So with the nutrition facts labels and changes to the nutrition facts labels, it's interesting to understand sort of, well, how does that have an effect on consumers' choices and information seeking behavior and decision-making behavior. Also to identify the potential for sources of misinformation and where consumers are hearing this more confusing information about carbohydrates. Also to think about the potential to conduct some social media listening to understand what's actually out there in social media and what's happening to communicate about food-related decision-making behaviors, specifically for carbohydrates. Some other next steps that we're thinking about are developing consumer messages. These were not actually developed as part of the phase 2 research. We did do some initial message framing, which we feel like needs to be refined, and there needs to be more input from experts to determine priorities and challenges. We also feel like we can't look to consumers themselves to create messages. We can only test message frames, and so final messages that include a rationale and clear call to action for decision making will be important to develop to help consumers make better choices. We can use our learnings from phase 1 and phase 2 of our research and also explore expert and consumer misalignment on those specific foods that have the greatest need for message development and clarification: the pasta, the potatoes, and the other foods that landed in the middle, like alternative milks. So with that, we look forward to working with IFINS more in the future to develop additional insights and better understanding on consumer understanding of nutrition related to carbohydrate foods and their quality. So thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. And just to remind everyone to click on the question mark icon if you have questions, and I will do my best to combine them. We have just a couple minutes available for questions, but before we do, I want to say I'm sure everyone has their own moment of surprise when they see your results. For me, there's two surprises here. The first was that a lot of people didn't recognize fruits and vegetables as foods that were important sources of carbohydrates. So maybe that feeds into this whole idea of restricting carbohydrates so much in people's diets because they don't realize the healthful parts of the carbohydrate spectrum that they're being highly encouraged to eat more of, and I'm sure everyone knows that. And the second is, for me, it was really amazing that for all these years when we've been emphasizing added sugars or sugars, simple carbohydrates, we still have a lot of consumers talking about starchy foods. So that's still alive and well for consumers. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question here. And the question is, what's the number one, if you had to pick just one misperception or point of confusion that you recommend be addressed with consumers based on your consumer focus groups about decisions for the healthfulness of carbohydrate foods? What would that number one priority be for you?
I think it's kind of what you mentioned, Barbara, where consumers are really aligning carbohydrate foods with things that are to be limited, that are bad. So they make this association between carbohydrates, carbs, and thinking that they need to limit them. So there's this connection that needs to be made between those higher quality foods and fruits and vegetables, as you mentioned, and carbohydrate foods. So I think we need to create some messaging of some kind that really shows the superstars of the carbohydrate food spectrum. So yeah, that's where I think the biggest issue is sort of the demonization of carbohydrates that's been going on for many years with different kinds of diets that are out there in consumer landscape.
Okay, thank you. And next question is, when you showed the slide that had starch and sugar as factors that were really important to consumers, but then it took a while before you got down to fiber, is that because you forced them to pick priorities and they went from top to bottom, or was it open-ended and they could have picked fiber along with sugar and starch and they just didn't?
Well, we did the research in a couple of different ways. First, we asked them top of mind, what are the things that help you understand what makes a food a carbohydrate food? And then we also kind of polled them, did a live poll. And it was in those top of mind responses that we didn't really hear the fruits and vegetables. We heard the starches and the added sugars. But as the conversation started to go along, and then we did some polling, and the groups were kind of coming together and understanding and discussing these things, fruits and vegetables started to come up to the top as an important factor in their decision making. So once they got the information, they wanted to use it. They took that understanding. And so I think that that's what's really clear to me here is that consumers, they want the information about making healthy choices. It's just that they need to have the exposure of how to make those better decisions. And they need the messages. Obviously, we hear that they do have important considerations when making carbohydrates. They understand that added sugars, which has been an important message, are important in their decision making. They also know about whole grains. That was really clear. And they do understand the importance of consuming fruits and vegetables. And now these days, I think they're also hearing the messages about ultra processed foods, and those kinds of concerns were coming through in their decision making for carbohydrates as well, with the added sugars and thinking about the amount of processing in the foods that they're wanting to choose. So they're balancing all these factors, and I think they need more guidance to think about those important connections between the higher quality carbohydrate foods and that they are carbohydrates and the importance that they have on human nutrition, specifically on brain health. There's so much interest in brain health these days. I think that maybe making those connections also to plant-based foods. Most of carbohydrates are plant-based foods. So I think we have some traction that we can gain. I think there's some existing messages we can kind of work with. And but it's important, and consumers want this kind of information, and they are listening. Those that really care about making good decisions are listening to things that are happening on the internet, and they're out on social media, and that's where we need to be careful because it's a landscape we know that is full of misinformation. So getting the right things there are
Perfect.
important.
So key message is balancing, rebalancing from not just the what to avoid, but what to eat more of, because it seems like they go first to the what to avoid and the other is harder. All right. Thank you, Elisa. We're going to go to the next talk. Thank you.
Today, we're going to talk about a tool to compare how experts rate carbohydrate foods. My name is Josh Marino. I'm a bioengineer by training, where I studied regeneration and inflammation-driven disease pathology in a dish before transitioning into biostatistics and nutrition during my F32 Brain Initiative-funded postdoc at Tufts University. While I was there, I worked on the statistical models and algorithms for both the Global Dietary Database and the Food Compass projects. Over the last 3 years, I've been stumbling along in an entrepreneurial capacity as the founder of Bespoke, which aims to make science more accessible and actionable by developing tools that help support better health decisions. I have 2 disclosures to make. The first is that I've previously received a research contract in 2021 from the Florida Department of Citrus, and I'm the of Bespoke. I want to start with a picture of where we're going to end up today. You'll learn about what a meta-nutritional profiling system is, why it was created, what problem it solves, and how to use the interactive tool and database to simultaneously ask your research questions and receive consensus-driven food health information for carbohydrate-rich foods. We're going to skirt over a lot of technical details today, so I really encourage you to check out our published paper in the International Journal of Food Sciences and Nutrition for more information. This webinar covers 3 main objectives, from background knowledge to learning about the nuts and bolts of how to use this interactive tool for research or general purposes. And it's really important that you should tune into the next webinar of this series to learn more about specific types of insights that this tool provides. The first objective focuses on this idea of harmonized expert ratings and includes some technical details to give you some intuition for how it works behind the scenes. You may have heard of the terms nutrition profiling systems or nutrient density before. Essentially, these are all algorithms created by experts with the goal of defining and quantifying food healthfulness. We started this work by selecting a diverse list of individual NPSs, including the nutrient-rich food systems, the food compass, the food processing score, and Nutri-Score. We then codified them all into the same statistical format, essentially a score from 1 to 100, with 100 being the most healthy, and evaluated the food supply, which was 6,500 foods in a database known as FNDD. and then we plotted the results all the way on the right. And I think one thing you can visually appreciate from this density chart is how globally heterogeneous the health scores using these various definitions are. I remember kind of just staring at the screen for a little while when I first saw this pop up on my code viewer, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I realized the central problem is that there are too many health scores and definitions of healthy, and we don't currently have a scientific method to evaluate their accuracy. It's like the wild, wild west for food health, and consumers and decision makers are not well equipped for battle. And so our solution was to establish a framework and interactive tool to kind of harmonize these disparate scoring systems, and in doing so, to highlight the circumstances surrounding the potential sources and key areas of disagreement. And that's really why this meta NPS was created. The innovation that was developed is using consensus as a way to harmonize these systems. Pretty much everything on the right-hand side beyond the individual nutrient profiling systems. And to our knowledge, comparative food healthfulness has not yet been considered in the more general context of meta-science. And we believe we're establishing new statistical meta-methodologies that could also apply elsewhere. For example, in the emerging field of polygenetic risk scores and heterogeneous individual level disease risk seems to have a lot of parallels. In any case, let's take a look at the key components of a meta-NPS, keeping in mind that nearly every process, cut point, or analytical decision is like wet cement at this early stage, and I'm open to thoughts on how to improve it. So a meta-NPS for any given food, for example, whole wheat bread, has a metascore, which is defined for the sake of today's talk as the median score across all of the systems. And it accounts for the consensus of the score, something that we are referring to as the score stability. And an overall index known as the Food Recommendation Index, which consolidates these two aspects of the meta-NPS. This tool can be helpful for a variety of applications and use cases. For example, if you're in clinical practice, rate foods in a food retail system, or a researcher using rating system to design or interpret studies, or even a health-conscious individual, the meta system gives you an overall score across 5 unique systems, and eventually as many as we want to include, and lets you know where there is expert disagreement. For people managing a food rating system, this tool provides metrics to help you identify gaps in which your ratings may differ systematically from others, which highlights an opportunity to seek consensus between these individuals and their systems. Zooming in a little bit, we're taking a look now at a healthfulness box plot. Each dot on this chart indicates health percentile rating from one of the expert systems. For example, whole wheat bread has ratings ranging from about the bottom 10 all the way up to around the 100th percentile. In other words, it's either unhealthy or very healthy, depending on who you ask. And it's worth mentioning that we've only sampled a small fraction of possible scores that exist, but we believe our sampling was sufficiently diverse enough, geographically, statistically wise, to get started. Obviously, the inclusion of selected individual NPS has implications for the downstream applications, similar to any other meta type of analysis. More details regarding the selections are provided in the brochure at the beginning of the webinar. And importantly, this flexible framework can accommodate many additional iterations. A metascore is a proxy of these health scores, which higher or lower values indicating more or less healthy, respectively. Similarly, we believe health consensus is desirable for fair decision-making, and we are taking a democratic approach to health consensus. Now that you have an intuition for the components of the meta-NPS, let's take a look at a new user interface we've developed, which leverages our overall healthfulness measure, the Food Recommendation Index, and consumption patterns. In the center of your screen, we have a healthfulness impact chart showing whole wheat bread as an example with some meta-NPS summary statistics. The arrows convey information regarding our tentative cutoffs and their interpretations. I want to give some context for how to interpret each axis of this chart. First, the x-axis, health impact, is pretty straightforward. It's the consumption of the food measured as the average grams of carbohydrates per day. This was estimated from dietary records of individuals aged 4 and up using NHANES data. The y-axis, healthfulness, is derived from components of the meta-NPS. So this healthfulness measure is what we previously called the Food Recommendation Index. It's a proxy of healthfulness that identifies foods that are consistently rated as healthy. Essentially, the FRI allows us to collapse the nuance of the meta-NPS distribution for a single food into a single point. The FRI combines the Metascore, which is a proxy of health scores rated by multiple experts, and stability, which is a proxy of health consensus. Put it all together, we can say that whole wheat bread is uncertainly healthful and moderately impactful. In other words, it's somewhere in the central region of this chart. Zooming out a little bit and looking at more than just whole wheat bread, now we see that each dot is one of 122 of the most commonly consumed carbohydrate-rich foods in the United States. The colors are mapped to the level 1 food categories present in the database. And now what we're going to do with this chart is start to overlay some key healthfulness regions to help improve the interpretation. First, as an illustrative cutoff, anything toward the top 25 points of the FRI will contain certainly healthy foods. Those that have both a high Metascore and a high stability, consensus, and certainty. Next, any food underneath the bottom 15 points of the FRI will contain certainly unhealthy foods, those with a low Metascore and a high stability, consensus, and certainty. A lower range for this category was chosen because it's more likely that foods with higher uncertainty also have a lower FRI. In the middle, we have foods that are neutral, somewhere with a Metascore in the middle, but high stability, and those that are uncertain. So they either have a lower or high Metascore, but they have low stability and high uncertainty. Now we're going to take a second to show you a step-by-step tutorial on how to actually, and demo on how to use the interactive meta-NPS. So I'm going to switch my screen now to the actual tool in place of the slides. And so now we're looking at our healthfulness impact chart, the same thing that was just on the slides before. And you can see as I scroll over various foods that all of their meta-NPS statistics pop up. On the bottom hand, we have each food listed with a number of summary statistics, anywhere between the category it's involved in, the grams of carbohydrate, usual intake of the food, the food recommendation index using a stability measure on the interquartile range, the Metascore, the stability score by itself, the min and max values and their respective systems that they belong to. These two components are bidirectionally linked. So if I go to whole wheat bread, for example, and I drag and drop a box around it, you can see that it updates the database on the bottom. When you double click on the chart, you reset the beginning to go back to where we started, and you can go back the other way around. So I can say, let's look for whole wheat bread. And there's two varieties of whole wheat bread, and what we can do is, select both of them in this table down here, and you'll see it pop up top. That's all well and good. There's also an additional interactive layer here in the legend, so we can double click on elements of the legend. Let's look at desserts, for example, and that will filter the database for only the food groups that are shown here. So now if we wanted to find the dessert with the most healthfulness, we can just go and look and say it's pan dulce. The idea. We can also now overlay an additional food category on there. Let's go for fruits and vegetables. And you see that fruits and vegetables, in contrast to desserts, are much tending towards the higher level of healthfulness. And to reset, to get to where we go, like I said, you just double click on the center. For the food legends, it's a little tricky. You kind of have to double click until you get back out. But that's essentially the nuts and bolts for how this works. You can go beyond just a single food, and if you wanted to do a selection of foods, some that are pretty uncertain and have a moderate level of impact, you can create a box like that, and then you can kind of go through and see, are there interesting foods that you want to look down here to get a better look for where they're at. So corn tortilla. We mentioned that it's bidirectionally linked with the database. Everything's filtered on click. And to summarize, we've introduced the Meta NPS as a bridge between science and food health information. A user can query this tool with a number of questions about specific foods, which references in the back end a harmonized, consensus-driven expert rating database before returning the relevant healthfulness attributes specific to that food and their research question. I would like to acknowledge several of my friends and collaborators who have contributed over the years to making this work more likely to have an impact across science, food, and health. And please reach out to me by email, LinkedIn message, or through our website with any questions, comments, or insights. And thank you for your time.
Hello, Josh, and thank you. I'm going to be thanking you 3 times. So thank you, number 1. All right, so I think what surprised me most by this talk was the fact that when you showed the chart that had the top group, which was the high Metascore, we were certainly healthy because it had a high Metascore and it was consistently ranked high between all the different systems. There were so few foods there. Was the reason most foods didn't get there because they just simply aren't highly ranked, or were the real deciding factors that caused it to fall down into the middle more that there was high disagreement? Like, which of those 2 factors pulled it down?
It's a kind of a balanced combination between the two. So, and we have to remember that that's only, like 100 foods out of however many thousand are in that database. So, the reason that it can either be high is, the only reason it can be high is that everyone consistently agrees that it's very healthy. Other than that, as you go down, you get a balance between people thinking it's healthy, and then the disagreement also kind of blows that out and reduces the overall healthfulness.
Yeah, the fact that whole wheat bread is in the middle is one of those standouts, like, oh, okay, really? All right. Okay, so we have just a couple minutes and we have a couple more talks by you. So what I'd like is for you to highlight just one top application of this tool. Like, if someone is sitting on this webinar and they're a researcher, or they're in dietary guidelines, policy decision-making space, or they're maybe doing some sort of direct messaging to consumers, can you pick one kind of top application and say, this is how you, and explain who the target is, this is how you could use this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one that I just showed even has population consumption patterns, so I think that naturally trickles into policy level folks because it deals with population health. But the underlying database underneath of it that evaluates food health consensus, I think, has much broader applications. Do you know what the #1 health and wellness app that was most recently downloaded is?
Mm.
It was Yuka.
Yeah.
It's a food scanning tool that essentially just gives millions of consumers education on just one of those systems. So I think we have a great opportunity and responsibility to think about conflicting information and to think about what misinformation really means with these consumer-led tools. So it's kind of like a Janus-based application, and that gives some flavor for the 2 contexts.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to go to your next talk, and we'll keep answering questions as we go along, because your next talk is very applied. So thank you, and see you in a couple minutes.
Welcome, everyone. Today, this talk is on insights from the tool comparing expert food rating systems. My name is Josh Marino. I'm a bioengineer by training, where I studied regeneration and inflammation-driven disease pathology in a dish before transitioning into biostatistics and nutrition during my Brain Initiative F2-funded postdoc at Tufts University. While I was there, I worked on the statistical models and algorithms for both the Global Dietary Database and the Food Compass projects. Over the last 3 years, I've been stumbling along in an entrepreneurial capacity as the founder of Bespoke, which aims to make science more accessible and actionable by developing tools that support better health decisions. I have 2 disclosures to state. I have previously received a research contract in 2021 from the Florida Department of Citrus and I'm the owner of Bespoke. The tool to compare expert food rating systems is called a meta-nutritional profiling system, or meta-NPS. By considering the possibility of expert uncertainty and including diverse opinions, the meta-NPS enables novel questions that lead to a wide range of insights about a food's healthfulness and potential impact. For example, it can create novel food categories, particularly this uncertain category highlighted in blue. We'll walk through some examples to give you an intuition for what's happening behind the scenes. Then we'll move to some data that looked at recategorizing the food supply in terms of food group compositions, finding that 20% of carbohydrate-rich foods could be considered uncertain, with grains being the most uncertain at about 50%. Using uncertainty and expert consensus to identify these gaps is the first step toward any resolution. We will dive into the top 4 most commonly consumed infusing foods and explore why there's disagreement for these foods. Ultimately, we want to use this consensus-based framework to improve the understanding and communication of the healthfulness of foods, providing a tool to surface and help think through resolving disagreements and reduce rating uncertainty. Before we get started, I encourage you to go check out the first video about the meta-NPS, which contains a lot more detail and step-by-step foundational knowledge that this module seeks to build upon. And if you're really wanting to dig in, please go back and check out our paper for even more details and know-how. And in this talk, it's important to remember that we're focusing on carbohydrate-rich foods. This talk has 3 main objectives that align with the takeaway messages. We'll look at food classification, food group classifications, and surfacing uncertainty towards reducing that uncertainty. Let's take a look at how we're redefining healthfulness. Individual foods and their healthfulness and food group categories can be identified quickly using our interactive toolkit. This image represents the healthfulness impact chart. Building up to this chart is the focus of the How to Use module of the webinar. And as a reminder, these are all flexible cutoffs, nothing's set in stone. They're intended to provide general interpretive guidelines. Briefly, the y-axis is healthfulness and the x-axis is impact. The regions that are colored denote food healthfulness classifications: certainly healthy, uncertain or neutral, and unhealthy. While the food recommendation index, the y-axis, is useful for consolidating and visualizing a lot of foods, it imperfectly captures important nuance and variation. Let's take a look at some foods across this spectrum: apple, potato chips, white rice, and croissants. We use the tool to identify the foods, and now we're going to take a deeper look. These categories are derived from the Metascore and the consensus measures of the meta-NPS, which are shown graphically on this box plot. The y-axis is now health percentile, and each dot within a food reflects a single expert system rating. Apple, for example, is certainly healthy because it has a high Metascore and a high stability measure, in this case measured as a small interquartile range. Similarly, croissant is certainly unhealthy because it has a low Metascore with a tight consensus. For potato chips, there's relatively good agreement that this food is somewhere in the middle in terms of healthfulness as a neutral food. And lastly, it might be surprising to see that white rice is not agreed upon, with some systems ranking it in the 25th percentile and others upward of 60 and the 95th percentiles. This chart with these 4 example foods out of around 3,000 also illustrates some of the complexities of the category cutoffs, particularly those that only rely on one stability or consensus measure. In this case, we're showing the interquartile range-based one. And this uncertain category is one that we're going to revisit later with more food examples. Now that we've looked at some individual foods and have a better intuition for the categories and where they come from, a natural question that we asked was, how does this translate to food group composition? Before diving into the results, I want to give a sense for the information that's shown on the slide and the subtle differences between the pie chart and the foods that will show up in the table. So the pie chart on the left represents the composition of healthfulness for all foods reported consumed within that category. In contrast, the table will show some more commonly consumed individual foods that were sampled in approximate proportions to what is shown in the pie chart. So for fruits and vegetables, we should expect there to be more certainly healthy foods and no certainly unhealthy ones. There's a big chunk of green and no chunk of red. And that's kind of what we see here. So we have bananas, apples, and grapes, and we have French fries in the certainly neutral category. In contrast, for desserts, we have a food of honey, which is uncertain, and those other ones, which are certainly unhealthy. And with this type of approach, it's clear to see that food groups have unique fingerprints. Extending beyond these two more homogeneous food categories to more food groups shows that grains may be the most uncertain, with just over half of grain foods having this classification, followed by mixed dishes and then beverages. I'm not going to get into the details of all the foods in this chart because the main idea is really to think about what we can do with this gray area. And really a major contribution of all of this work would be to focus and resolve all of the foods that are in this middle light gray region. Now that we have a deeper appreciation of novel food classification insights, I want to dig deeper into how might we use the meta-NPS to prioritize and eventually resolve some disagreements. One way that meta-NPS could be used would be to quickly surface the disagreements for common foods, those with a high impact potential. Here's how we use the tool to do this. So we have our health impact chart on the left. And we drew a selection rectangle around the central region of the tool that was slightly right shifted to pick those that are consumed more frequently and for quantities than others. This filtered the list of 122 of the most commonly consumed carbohydrate-rich foods down to 17, with the top 10 shown in the table on the right. We then used the interactive data table that's underneath of this chart that you can't see in this presentation to filter this selection by decreasing rank range, the dotted box that's in the right-hand column, which is one of our stability measures. And remember, a higher rank range indicates more uncertainty and less consensus. Lastly, we selected just the top 4 foods: wheat bread, iced tea with sugar, white rice, and white bread, that are the most uncertain yet potentially impactful. After identifying these foods, we can look deeper into the details, just like we did at the beginning of the talk with those 4 examples. But in contrast to those 4 examples, which had some of the certainly healthful categories, here are the healthfulness box plots showing how each expert system rates these uncertain foods, which can be used to visualize the scoring inconsistencies as a way to help understand what's going on here. So first, to confirm, all foods have a rank range greater than 69. This means that each of these foods would essentially be either unhealthy or healthy, depending on who is asked. After surfacing these foods, we were unable to find quick and easy explanations for why or what could be changed to improve the consensus of these foods. There isn't very repeatable and consistent patterns across all of the 5 systems that were able to be extracted. Given the inherent complexity, I wanted to provide something more progressive for what we could do with this tool moving forward. And as a fair warning, this may be a provocative teaser example about food processing. So we've highlighted and identified and surfaced foods with high uncertainty so far, but how can we suggest changes or think about promoting more consensus? In this example, we're looking at one food and one variable, food processing, as a way to think about redesigning the systems of food healthfulness. The idea is to formally ask and quantify what would happen to our summary statistics and overall healthfulness conclusion if we remove systems with processing in their attribute. So on the left, we have our original healthfulness distribution for whole wheat bread from the meta-MPS, with each system listed next to its ranking. On the right, we have the revised meta-MPS distribution, and the result of removing processing would mean an increased metascore, increased consensus and stability on the interquartile range scale and on the rank range scale, yielding an overall improved healthfulness rating. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that this is a reason to automatically drop processing as a factor affecting how a food is scored. What this means is that processing as an attribute is a factor driving lack of agreement between systems, at least for whole wheat bread, and therefore should be a priority to resolve. Factors driving differences in consensus would be priorities for experts to consider during system revisions with the goal of reducing uncertainty and increasing consensus. Let's now overlay this process onto our original healthfulness impact view. Here we can see that removing any system with processing in it would result in a reclassification of whole wheat bread, reducing the number of foods in this gray area. But obviously, this example comes with a ton of caveats. For one, we only showed the stabilizing effect on one food, not across the entire food supply. Who knows what would happen in aggregate? Second, there is no scientific method to prove the best system to define healthy. So excluding any system with epidemiologic or other validity may be cherry picking and result in poor overall consensus or accuracy. All this to say that defining healthfulness is as much of an art as it is a science, and we want to think about using this tool to facilitate dialogue to reduce areas of uncertainty, potentially by suggesting or testing various hypotheses in the manner we described with this example. Look outward. This slide shows the roadmap to build toward dynamic and personalized nutrition. Achieving this goal would require scientists to come together collaboratively while simultaneously considering the health goals and physiology of consumers. In terms of next steps, nutrient profiling system creators should come together to resolve disagreements with a transparent process. In parallel, alignment between experts and consumers should be evaluated. And ultimately, communication strategies intending to aid consumer decision-making should leverage expert-consumer alignment to evaluate overall campaign efficacy. I would like to acknowledge several of my friends and collaborators who have contributed over the years to making this work likely to have an impact across science, food, and health. And please reach out to me by email, LinkedIn message, or through our website with any questions, comments, or insights. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Josh. I'm always amazed when I watch these, not being a statistician or a data person the way you are. You think about things quite differently, and you really help us as nutrition people challenge our assumptions and thoughts. So thank you for always doing that and being patient explaining complex things. So I think the processing one is fascinating, and I'm glad you said you were neutral about whether it should be in or out. That's not our job to decide, but it is one of the factors that's really driving the disagreement between these groups. Is there another factor you would say is also, I know you haven't maybe tested it, but on the top of your list that you would hypothesize might be a driver of the differences between categories? One or two, what would those be that you would suggest be follow-ups to look at?
That's a really tricky question to answer. I think part of it's hard because we're only looking at 5 systems out of hundreds that are out there, and this is the disagreement amongst just 5 of these. So it can only get worse from this point on. So that said, when you look at the box plots, when I tried to do this at least in some detailed manner, we haven't done the modeling yet, but there's no clear, consistent, pattern even amongst systems across foods. So, while the processing example was pretty clear for whole wheat bread, when you zoom out a little bit, things get a lot hairier and a lot more tricky to figure out. So I'm actually withholding from hypotheses until we do a more extensive kind of like expert belief mapping to just get everything on the table first before you start picking and choosing. Um, yeah.
So at this point, if someone's trying to decide what tool to use, which of these they have to use some sort of food ranking tool for whatever their decision making is. Can they use your tool then to take a look at it at maybe their top one or two choices and see where it's coming out, whether it's a consistent outlier or whether it's more in the middle, or is that an application for this tool that would work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, create a way to just, unclick and remove certain features. Like I think you can really make this whole thing interactive to make it into a living, breathing tool, to ask these questions, and not just me, but the whole community should be participating in doing these things, because at the end of the day, like what's more important than food health, and having a clear understanding and shared understanding about what that is.
Yeah, so even the people who are developing these food rating systems could get together and consolidate a project for themselves to figure out where the differences lie, right? If they want to come to agreement. And I should just reiterate here that when we talk about experts, we're talking about the fact that these are food rating systems developed by experts. So we're not talking about individual experts, right? This is always just how experts have informed the components that get put into the algorithms and the weights that are given to it. One other question for you, and our last question here, Josh, before we move on, is can you just remind us, we just focused on carbohydrate foods as an example. That's because it was funded by the Carbohydrate Committee. But do you have all foods in this data system, or what foods are in this that are available if somebody wants to look at them?
So all of FNDDS, USDA's research grade food composition database is in there, and we're working behind the scenes to create the crosswalks to the branded foods database to be able to expand it to all sorts of branded foods, and open up the door to a lot more extensive questions of the whole entire food supply.
Fabulous. It's really fabulous work. So thank you for that. And we are going to go to our next presentation, also by Josh. So see you in a couple minutes.
This video is going to show you results from an experimental research tool exploring expert consumer health belief misalignments for 20 carbohydrate-rich foods. Health belief misalignment is important if we want to realize the claimed benefits of nutrition as the largest opportunity for reducing rising chronic disease rates and living healthier lives. My name is Josh Marino. I'm a bioengineer by training, where I worked in a wet lab and studied the therapeutic potential of regenerative medicine and immunomodulatory biomaterials in chronic diseases. Had a bit of a plot twist about midway through my postdoc fellowship at Tufts University, where I transitioned into biostatistics and nutrition. At Tufts, I created algorithms and applied statistical models to both the Global Dietary Database and the Food Compass projects. Over the last 4 years, I've been independently building the Fresh Food Recommendations for Equitable, Sustainable Health platform, which aims to support better health decisions by making nutrition science more interactive, accurate, and actionable. I've been collaborating with Elisa Giardelli from NORC on this project, who led the qualitative consumer focus group sessions. Elisa has a master's in public health and is a registered dietitian with a strong research track record in campaign development and consumer interviews and surveys. Neither myself nor Elisa at NORC have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I want to give a general refresher and bird's eye view of this project. In collaboration with the Carbohydrate Committee at IFNS and NORC, we selected a list of 20 carbohydrate-rich foods to see how consumer health beliefs aligned with expert beliefs. The goal was to identify a short list of food priorities where there was the largest misalignment between consumers and experts, or where there was the largest disagreements among experts themselves. As part of the screener for their in-depth consumer group interviews, NORC asked consumers to rate the healthfulness of any given food in the list, and then they followed this up with, how certain are you? This certainty aspect was included in order to have more information to compare with a meta nutrition profiling system from Fresh, which harmonizes multiple expert included food rating systems and formally surfaces expert uncertainty in food rating. We won't go into too many details of the meta NPS today because they're the focus of the past 2 webinars, but a quick reminder that the misalignment results that you see shortly depend on the details and the limitations of that tool. At this point, before we dive in, I want you to take a few seconds to think about which foods in this list would fall into each of these three priority categories. You should answer 3 questions before we dive in, and feel free to hit pause if you're listening on YouTube. So out of these 20 foods, how many would receive a grade of C or D for consumers being well aligned with experts? How many of these foods would be classified as uncertainly healthy by experts? In other words, which foods might have some disagreement amongst only experts themselves? And finally, considering consumer expert misalignment, expert only disagreement, and how much of the food we eat in the United States, which 4 foods do you think you might want to prioritize for messaging? So what we found was that 17 out of 20 foods received a C or D, so that's 85% of the foods that we asked about for alignment grades. 15 out of 20 of the foods, so 75% of the foods were considered uncertain by experts, so there was large disagreements amongst experts. And the 4 overall priority foods that we found were white bread, fruit juice with vitamin C, white rice, and corn tortilla. And while these results are kind of cool and a little bit eye-opening, please remember that this project is really just getting started. Before we get into the rest of the results, I want to reiterate 2 things. First, experts are currently defined and operationalized using published nutrient profile models. This is without a doubt a restricted view of what constitutes an expert. However, it does raise more formal questions about who is an expert, whether there are different types of experts, and what insights we might learn by comparing across these different types of groups. Consider something like an epidemiologist, a dietitian, and a primary care doctor. Second, the limitations from the first 2 videos still apply to our interpretation of consumer expert alignment results. Namely, science doesn't currently have a method to evaluate the accuracy of any food rating system. You can think of creating a health algorithm or a food rating system kind of like throwing at a dart at a dartboard that either doesn't exist or that you currently can't see. This is one reason why I like to emphasize that even seemingly objective algorithms are reflections of expert beliefs and subjective algorithmic choices, even though they're more principled and transparent than other methods used for making health decisions. And all of these things are reasons why I believe that stacking models and including multiple experts and including model uncertainty will be incredibly useful in nutrition science like they are in other fields like weather forecasting. Zooming out a little bit, we initially discovered that almost every food was either misaligned or in disagreement, except for apple and soda. So 18 out of the 20 foods that we asked, fell into either one of these categories, obviously in their respective column being shown in red. These results were a little surprising and needed further information in order to come up with a more shortlisted, targeted list of priorities, maybe somewhere around 5 foods. So what I did was propose to layer in consumption preliminarily. And then I ended up creating this kind of tool. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit now and give a sense for how this tool works. In order to give flexibility into anyone making decisions or setting priorities and to reflect that this is an ongoing collaborative project, I created this interactive tool in Fresh. Before we interpret anything down here, let me walk you through what you're seeing. So at the top of this tool, you have drop-down menus that allow any user to filter by things like alignment grade from A to D, from consumption, separated into 3 categories: high carbohydrate intake to low carbohydrate intake, expert classification from healthy down to unhealthy, and food category from beverages down to snacks. The consumption quantities were estimated using, for the US population, age 4 and up, using 2017 and 2018 NHANES data. This cool circle under the misperception column represents a combination of 2 things. The misperception composition, which is reflected in the color proportions, either purple or orange or a mix, as well as the total misperception based on the size of the circle. So positive orange, as in this case, indicates that the consumers thought it was more healthy than the experts. Negative misperception in purple generally indicates that consumers thought it was less healthy than the experts. So if we take honey as an example, you can interpret this circle by saying that honey was the most misperceived food with a predominantly positive consumer misperception composition. In contrast, French fries was the second most misperceived food with a predominantly negative consumer perception relative to experts. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, kind of what you might expect, that apple and soda were the were the most aligned of consumers relative to experts, even though they still exhibited a consumer misperception signal. And if we just take a quick glance across all these foods, we can see that for almost every given food, consumer misperception can be both negative and positive. This means that there may be difficulties for one-size-fits-all messaging, and ultimately that aligning health perceptions may require a more bespoke, personalized approach. So in order to use this tool to arrive at a more manageable number of priorities, essentially what I did was filter by alignment grade. So I said anything that was a C or a D, and fell into the high carbohydrate intake and was uncertain by experts. And we end up with this short list of foods. So we have white rice, corn tortilla, white bread, fruit juice, and vitamin C. Their respective misperception compositions and quantities are shown here. The green in consumption indicates that they're highly consumed, and then you obviously have their expert class of uncertain and the end alignment grade. So what we just saw was how we used this tool to identify 4 priority foods based on key criteria. They had high consumer misperception, an alignment grade of D or C, expert classification of uncertain, or consumption of high carbohydrate intake of greater than 1 gram of carbohydrate per day. Now I want to take another step back to look at all the foods in more detail in terms of consumer misperception relative to experts. Let's double click on this column right here. And now what you're seeing is a zoomed in and expanded version of the circles we looked at in the previous table, layered in and clustered by food groupings. On the y-axis, we have misperception, and the horizontal lines that you see here in green, yellow, and red denote the cutoffs that are currently used for assigning alignment grades. Then obviously on the right-hand side, we can see the alignment grade distribution. So there's 2 Ds, 15 Cs, 2 Bs, and 1 A. And essentially what we found was that in this sample of foods, misperception of consumers relative to experts was not really related in any material way to food group. It seems pretty much that most foods, 15 out of 20, all fell within a similar range, especially within this C range here. Something that this chart also shows or suggests is a predominantly negative perception across all of these foods. If you take a look at the preponderance of these purple bars across this whole chart relative to orange, you see that there's a much more negative view of foods for this selection. And interestingly, this is a pattern that's also observed in Elisa's independent focus group sessions and qualitative interviews. So consumer misperception may be skewed overall towards being negative. We just have a negative view of foods. Let that sink in for a second. And really what we should be thinking is, how can we develop messaging that is food specific, yet still acknowledges trends across all these preliminary foods and honors the complexity of even within a given food, that there can be divergence within the population about their perception. Now that we've gone in pretty detail in terms of consumer expert alignment, I want to take another step back and double click on where this expert uncertainty is coming from and what that kind of look like. We talked a little bit about this in the last 2 webinars, but for these specific foods, I want to give a sense of what the meta NPS shows. So now we're looking at a zoomed in and expanded version of the uncertain label for experts only, that layered in with food groupings and ordered in the same manner as the misalignment results. So all of this, again, is derived from the meta NPS, and more details can be found in those previous 2 videos. On the y-axis, what we have is a health percentile from 0 to 100. Higher meaning it's in the higher percentile, and that's generally the healthiest food that it can be. And for each food, the box plot shows the distribution of health ratings across 5 systems. So each one of these dots is a rating from one of these 5 systems listed here on the left. And what we can interpret for fruit juice, for 100% juice, is that the experts had a health rating in between somewhere around 30 all the way up to 100. That's a difference of somewhere around 70, which is why this food is colored in light gray and considered as uncertainly healthy. And just as a important note to suggest here that fruit juice with vitamin C, not 100% fruit juice, has a lower downward shifted distribution of healthfulness relative to 100% juice. I really like this figure because it showcases that expert agreement is possible. If you take a look at something like Apple, where there's a really tight spread or distribution of the health ratings, while at the same time contextualizing the extent of the disagreement for these carbohydrate-rich foods. So if I'm looking in the grain section, for example, what I see is just like pretty much it's almost all completely uncertain. And this is in alignment with results that we talked about on the previous webinar from the Insights video. To summarize, we've created an experimental framework and an interactive tool to prioritize foods based on consumer expert misperception, expert-only disagreements, and consumption. It's possible and reasonable to suggest that messaging and next steps should be tailored depending on the audience. So we're just kind of summarizing this with a little bit more foods here based on these two categories. So on the left, we have consumer expert priorities. You can see what's filtered up here. This is the short list of 8 foods, and pretty much because there's so much uncertainty in this current sample of foods, it's very similar for the expert-only priorities with the exception of French fries, which was labeled as a neutral food based on the MedMPS and the experts. So moving forward, what are we thinking about doing next? I think it's really imperative that nutrient profiling system creators or, even just the general food health movement right now should come together to resolve disagreements with a transparent process if and whenever possible. It might even be the case that, sometimes these disagreements are just genuinely disagreements and we're going to have to find ways to communicate that in a clear way to consumers. Communication strategies intending to aid consumer decision-making should leverage expert consumer alignment to evaluate overall campaign efficacy. When I see that bullet point, I think about all of the comments and threads about misinformation out there. Well, how can you have misinformation if the experts themselves are kind of in disagreement for a bunch of these foods? And really what's important is that in the absence of a gold standard or known truth, that bidirectional education between consumers and experts in tandem with more research to elicit our beliefs and create a more shared understanding of where they come from and why. All of that's really critical to moving the needle and delivering on the promises of nutrition science. I'd like to acknowledge Elisa Giardelli from NORC, Barbara Lyle from IFINS, the Carbohydrates Committee also from IFINS, and a bunch of other collaborators along the way. Please reach out to me by email, LinkedIn message, or through my website with any questions, comments, or insights, and thank you for your time.
Well, hello, Josh and Elisa. I think this is the part of the talk that was most exciting to me because you really pulled everything together here at this point. And again, it's just so surprising to me how consumers have tuned into or been inundated with messaging, with all the negative messaging, which means that they are not quite as in tune with the positive message. And that leads to some of the disconnect we're seeing, which was, I think, Josh, you pointed out, there's a preponderance of the disconnects between consumers and the experts through the food rating systems being specifically in the consumer underrating the healthfulness. So we have a really provocative question that I want to put out to you, which is, I think, first of all, you can clarify if this is correct, that most of those food rating systems or all of them are based on composition of the foods. And if that's true, then what would happen if instead of rating foods on the composition, like sugar content, fiber content, nutrient density, saturated fat, sodium, what if instead the food rating system was based on the relationship between the food and a health outcome? So, for example, a food might be more satiating, or a carbohydrate food might be more associated with long-term cognitive health. Like, what happens if you flip it away from composition to health benefits? Is that a good idea or not practical?
I think it's a phenomenal idea. Conceptually, I think you run into challenges when, you have to ask why, why is the food satiating? And, is there actually social elements? Like, how can we separate the social elements of eating from the compositional elements? I think that's like, if we could do that and do that with certainty and clarity, that, that's absolutely the future. I think the challenge is, figuring that stuff out, which hopefully these tools will help us get to. So, I love that question, whoever asked that.
I'd like to chime in here because I think that this would require a lot of research, and also there's so much uncertainty with the physiological processing of how the body actually processes foods. And to the point of some of the work that Josh has done, that it's also very individualized. Different people process foods in different ways, and so they have different health outcomes. So I think that that is a huge challenge with this, and that's why I feel like sometimes the focus on what's in the food and the composition of the food, and also how it's made and where it comes from, is what is important for decision making in sort of the consumer landscape. You know, the things that are in the rating systems, which are really important and matter, you know, are compositional. But in some of the groups that we talked with, there were also things that were important to consumers: where the food is grown, if it's organic, how it's made, is it clean? All kinds of other factors are coming into the decision-making process for consumers when they're making decisions.
And do you sense the latter is because they're so confused about the nutrition that they kind of shift their focus and go, okay, well, I can at least understand whether it's local, and they look for that because that's an anchor.
I believe so. And I think also the concept of whole foods, whole fruits and vegetables, whole grains, that is really coming across to consumers as something that they can grab onto in decision making. But there's just so many factors, I mean, and so many different kinds of products that consumers are making choices about every day.
And to wrap up as a last question, Josh, can you just reiterate, this is an active live tool that anyone could go in and look at, or because you were showing us live how you were doing that. Can you just remind us what it is and how people would get to that?
Yeah, it's an active website. I think just probably reach out to me because it's a long, weird website name right now. But you know, we're working on making it more consumer friendly. But yeah, send me an email and I can send you the tool.
Okay. All right, perfect. At this point, we're going to ask the panelists to join us. And as they're coming live, I'll just give a little bit of background. So this is the part of the webinar where we're now going to really focus on a few priorities. So you've seen a lot from the consumer perspective, a lot from the ranking. Now we're going to look at what are the priorities that would have the greatest impact on um, improving messaging about food sources of carbohydrates. It would focus on the misinformation and the confusion. So just as a reminder, we are avoiding the dichotomous terms of healthy versus unhealthy because that's defined by FDA. If we make a mistake, we'll just ask for your apology in advance. We really are talking about a range of healthfulness. Also notice that we are aiming to be inclusive of all dietary guidance. So we're not just focused on the carbohydrate components or nutrient density. We're really focused on holistically, how does a food fit the dietary guidance? So sodium, added sugars, saturated fat, recommending whole grains, eating more fruits and vegetables, eating more whole grains. I'm sorry, I already said that. All coming together, right? So what are the priorities to help consumers when they're making specific food choices about foods that contain carbohydrates so that they can include more of those positive messages that help them meet overall carbohydrate guidance rather than restricting, like just giving up and restricting needlessly. Before we start, I'm going to ask our two esteemed internationally recognized experts, Joanne Slavin and Adam Drunowski, to introduce themselves, and then I'll come back on and I'll ask the first question. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for including me. Great to hear all this interesting research. So my disclosures will probably identify you. I probably run into most people that are on this call in some way, and you would say this person totally lacks focus. But I will remind you that I've worked in dietary fiber for many years. So if there's one hat that I can wear, I feel like I'm the fiber queen, and I use it a lot as my tagline. So if you ever want to hack one of my accounts, it might get you there. But you also say, is there anybody that this person doesn't work for? And I have so many friends out in the world that include me in wonderful things. So those scientific advisory boards, they are all over the place. People that love carbohydrates, people that hate carbohydrates, and I learned so much talking to all people. I grew up on a dairy farm, so right away I have a bias there down in Walworth, Wisconsin, that I now own and manage. I'm an employee of the University of Minnesota. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition, which I really appreciate because having that food science side has helped me greatly. Some other consulting fees and honorariums, and most recently money from, appreciate any money I get from any company. So um, I'm a dietitian, and I always like to talk about, I started 100% extension. So trying to communicate nutrition and foods topics to consumers is something really important to me.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Drevnovsky, and I'm professor of epidemiology, and I'm with the Center for Public Health Nutrition at the University of Washington in Seattle. I do research on social disparities, spatial distribution of obesity, the relationship between diet quality and cost. And for some time now, I guess I'm now a nutrient profiling system creator. I think Josh mentioned there were at least 200 nutrient profiling systems, probably too many. I think I'm probably responsible for about 50 of those. I think Joanne, didn't we create 2 at least between the 2 of us? And probably more, and still counting. So I think that this is a rapidly growing field. And I was very fascinated to hear about the disparities between consumer perception, what the experts think, and what the nutrient profiling systems say. We can discuss it in great detail. So these are my disclosures. And I've been working with a number of companies because nutrient profiling has become the means for product reformulation. And each country and each company wants a nutrient profiling system of its own for its product line. So this is actually very interesting. Nutrient profiling used to be thought of as a consumer education tool, but now it has become a major tool for product reformulation. We'll talk about that one as well. So I think that's all about me for now.
Adam, thank you for bringing that up because I've worked at a food company, and each food company is its own entity and has its own priorities and commitments, public health commitments. So that is a really valid application where they may have some differences from what's used publicly with consumers. Yeah. All right. So let's start out on a positive note, just really briefly, starting with Elisa and then Josh, and then we'll go to Adam and Joanne in that order, so there's no confusion. I want to ask you to just start off with your top line perception of what is working right in terms of consumers' understanding of carbohydrate foods that are relatively more healthful and should be included in more often in healthful diet patterns and also in the food rating systems. And if you can be clear about which one of those you think it's working well for, whether it's in consumers' perceptions versus in the food rating tools, that would be helpful too, because we have 2 different targets here going at the same time. So Josh, kick it off, please.
I'm kicking it off. Yeah. So
Sorry,
I think
the order. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say apple and soda. That's clearly working. So whatever we're doing with apple and soda seems to be, top tier. I think everything else I'm going to refrain from giving an opinion on.
I think for me, the importance of understanding good decision making and choosing high quality carbohydrates are factors that are really working for consumers. And they have a desire. They want information, and they are using a lot of these systems. So which one is the one? I don't really feel like, as from Josh's research, we can see there is one that or 2 that are standing out. I mean, we know we do know which ones people are using, but we also, I think, need to really recognize the importance of collaboration, as you're saying, with industry, with academia, with government, and coming to some alignment so that we can give good guidance to consumers.
Adam, you're up.
I think Alyssa got it right when she said that carbohydrates are a misunderstood nutrient or misunderstood macronutrients. We have the protein foods group, we have fats and oils, and yet 50% of the calories in our diet come from carbohydrates. And when people talk about carbohydrates, they kind of defer to or default to pasta, bread, and potatoes and rice. And I think the first issue is broaden your horizons, exactly as you say, and include the vegetables and the fruit. And let's not forget the pulses, beans and peas and chickpeas and lentils. And then USDA made this distinction between the non-starchy non-starchy vegetables and starchy vegetables. Nothing wrong with corn or the carrots or the potatoes. They're all in the vegetable group. Let's not separate them out. So they're kind of artificial boundaries that we have done. And I think expanding the horizons is the main issue. Exactly as you said before, a misunderstood macronutrient, let's expand it. Because we consume so many carbohydrates, each carbohydrate calorie ought to be laden with nutrients. And this is where nutrient profiling comes in. We'll come to that.
Joanne, what are we getting right?
I always need to say I was on the dietary guidelines in 2010, and every time people say, hey, you guys are stupid, it doesn't work, it really does work as far as saying we need more fiber, we need less extra calories, so added sugar. So I think a lot of times we give up and say, oh, nothing works, but actually a lot of things work really well. I'm going to go back to on the my dietitian side and teaching advanced human nutrition, 45 to 65% of our calories should come from carbohydrates. That is the recommendation of the dietary reference intakes, and that gives us a lot of space to play in. And as Adam and everybody's talked about, fruits, vegetables, grains, pulses, all these places we can get it. What's in an apple? If we look at nutrients, apple doesn't have that much fiber and it doesn't have very many vitamins and minerals. So if consumers think the apple is the be all and the end all and the pop is the worst, that's not real helpful. To me, it's really calories. And within those calories, we have to take added sugar and refined starches out when you don't need those calories. So if we can get you to eat carbohydrate staples, the dairy, the fruit, all of the things we recommend in the food groups, then, and convince consumers that that's good, that's where we want to go. But I would absolutely, the question of what are consumers looking for, it's not all this detail. And every time we get it really detailed and like boring, they get not very interested. So that's why new concepts like ultra processing are interesting to people, because, hey, that gives me a new way of looking at food. Yeah, local, organic, all these other things. And I just think sustainability. When I always tell my students, they're like, why would we eat so many carbohydrates? Most sustainable, less expensive. And when we forget about price, we are fools in nutrient guidance. So carbohydrates, we are omnivores. We can eat a lot of carbohydrates. So let's just elevate those carbohydrate staples up, tell consumers they're doing a good job, and enjoy those wonderful foods that right now in the summer, hey, I'm going to go to the farmer's market. That peach is going to taste darn good, even if it came from Colorado. So I think we lose sight of the amazing part of carbohydrates, and we're always trashing them for being full of calories and not being very nutritious. So it's a tough sell, but I think that these nutrient profiling systems of just going out, nutrients are important because we need to bring those nutrients along. So maybe it's hopeless. I think just because it's so many of our calories that don't, let's not even talk about carbohydrates. It's just, let's talk about calories, because that's really the problem with carbohydrates is we're getting too many calories from them. So let's think about what's good about them and just really worry about not over consuming them.
And Elisa, just to follow up, a really quick question here on this. In your consumer work, did consumers tell you that fiber was part of carbohydrates, or did you have to lead them to that?
They didn't really say that it was a carbohydrate, like that is not a concept, but they understand that it's part of grains and fruits and vegetables. So they get that it's in there and they get that it's important and positive, but they're not really seeing it as a carbohydrate. And I think I want to go back to what Joanne was mentioning, though, and that is focusing on calories. And I think we've learned from, as a registered dietitian and counseling and understanding, like it's not the only thing that people are concerned about. And you mentioned that as well. But I also think that, the cat's out of the bag with carbohydrates. We can't ignore them. And that's kind of what I see has happened with my plate and the guidance that's coming out of USDA is that it's just not even there. Total carbohydrates, it's just not even a concept, but it's on the nutrition facts label. So the cat's out of the bag. We can't ignore carbohydrates as something that is part of the consumer landscape and understanding. We need to shift and think about expanding the horizons, as Dr. Janowski mentioned. And I think that the importance is coming up with those messages of what are the good parts about carbohydrates and why are they important, and how do we understand the landscape of them, and that they are foods that, as you mentioned, are mostly plant-based. They're things that are coming from the farmer's market. So I think we need to highlight these important positive parts of carbohydrates, and we can't ignore them at this point.
Elisa, can you take just 1 minute to weave in a question here that we had come in, and that's about the timing of carbohydrates. Did you have any consumers that told you that the type and the amount of carbohydrate that they felt was healthful for them depended on when the timing of eating it relative to expending energy? I know sports drinks came up, but it might have been even beyond that. Was there anything on that?
We did hear some things. I mean, they didn't become themes. They were sort of more individual viewpoints of, you know, eating them before they exercise, not eating them before bed, going to sleep, thinking about different times of days that they would consume them. It wasn't something that became a theme. So I really wouldn't put much on that in my mind. So that's my answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are to the main question that we're posing to you, which is what are the priority actions that each of you recommends for improving dietary messaging on food sources of carbohydrates, and give your rationale. And I also want to be clear that we have two different target audiences here. One is messaging to consumers through health professionals likely, and the other is messaging to people who are developing the algorithms used in the food rating systems. Okay, so be clear about which target audience your comment is primarily for. But again, what are the priority actions for improving, right? We covered what was working. Now, what do we recommend for improving? Let's go first with Adam, then Joanne, then Elisa, and Josh.
Well, I think the disconnect between the consumer and the experts in the nutrient profiling is very concerning, because there are various ways of assessing carbohydrate quality. One way looks at the relative ratio of carbohydrate to fiber to whole grains to added sugar. And that means that whole grain foods come on top and sweet bakery goods, desserts, and so on come on the bottom. But that is not the only thing that grains contain, because flour is enriched. So you have to have a different profiling model that takes into account the B vitamins, the folic acid, the iron, which are all in grain foods. If you base your profiling system only on whole grains, you miss out the benefits of fortified flour and fortified bread. So in fact, you almost need like two profiling systems, one for the fiber, whole grains, and sugar, and another one for the micronutrients, for the vitamins and minerals and protein. And this is why we have so many different profiling systems, because they all do a different job. And if you look at the profiling system which captures micronutrients, then things like ready-to-eat cereals and fortified bread come right on top. With the other system, it is going to be whole grain crackers and whole grain bread. So I think that those concepts need to be communicated to the consumer. There are many ways in which carbohydrates and grains can contribute to a healthy diet.
So I get to go next, and I always agree with Adam, and I loved working with him because we have to go with some things we accept. And for dietary guidance, these are the things we accept. You know, like we need to get rid of added sugar because it's extra calories. We want whole grains, so that we can't throw those out. Those are kind of accepted things, and then we have to fine tune the system. So I totally agree with this idea of rich and fortification. And it came up in a couple times the discussion, why would a consumer think that vitamin C added to orange juice that would make it healthier? Because, they've been taught that over time, and that, you need to get more of these nutrients. And for the enriched grains that are out there, the folic acid fortification in 1998, most people don't know that. And this is why this idea of getting rid of ultra processed foods, kick them out, they're terrible, only whole foods are good. That's where we really hurt ourselves. So these are the good carbs and the bad carbs. So the nuance is so it's like, and as a dietitian, people come to you and you're like, well, I understand why you want to get rid of ultra processed foods, throw them out, but a lot of the nutrients and the good nutrition we have and getting rid of nutrient deficiency diseases, they can come back if we forget all of our learning. So, I think this is the good, bad, the binary good, bad, 1, 2 is always going to get us in trouble. And I think that's where consumers are saying, your rules aren't that great, so I'm going to come up with my own rules. And I don't blame them. I think and consumers are king. Anybody that works at a food company, if they don't buy your stuff, so what? So listening to the consumers. So it's really interesting with this research of trying to combine those things and think about, can we work together and come out with a better outcome? Everybody will do better if we can kind of share our way of working. And it's very exciting.
I feel like we need to come together, though, in more conversations like this that are collaborative, create a community, and to Josh's point, maybe even an online or app-based community that help consumers and experts make decisions and weigh the factors and all the factors. And I do agree with Dr. Slavin on the importance of the historical nutrition fortification and other kinds of processing that's been added. Yes, we need to take that into consideration. But I think that the consumer understanding of all of the processing of foods is still important, because a lot of those things that Dr. Trudowski is mentioning that kind of, factor in and weigh in into the different profiling systems, put those whole grains on the top, right? They're very important, and they have all of the fiber, and they have all of the things that we know consumers are not getting enough of. So I think that coming together and, but also providing messaging on what are those important parts of making good choices related to carbohydrates. We have to message to that, because carbohydrates are there, and we need to help consumers make better decisions, and bring back the positive parts to carbohydrates instead of the negative perceptions.
Right. So I'm probably going to say something that's a little provocative, but bear with me a little bit here. So I'm holding two things, and both can be true at the same time. The first is Elisa's research that clearly is showing people just aren't getting their information from government-led sources. And I do think that that's trickling down to the research we're finding with misalignment for, C's and D's across the board for a lot of these foods. At the same time, we're all sitting here arguing and agreeing that we should collaborate together, and we're like talking about all these details and all these nuances. So personally, from a priority perspective, I would love to see kind of like a top-down supported national strategic effort for a bottom-up grass-led movement to create more translational and educational tools to personalize message and contextualize food health around diet quality and the things that people actually care about. And same goes for the experts too, but I'd love to see us more internalize the concept of accuracy instead of validity, and how can we really collaborate effectively using structured and transparent processes. So those two, consumer and expert-led thing, I think should be supported at a national level.
So I want to pick up on something that Adam and Joanne, you talked about, which is nutrient density or nutrients. So let's not just talk about carbohydrates here, but if you have an algorithm in which every single essential nutrient is essentially weighted the same, you are going to reward and rate higher foods that provide nutrients for which there is no need in our current food supply to have more, and things like folic acid, which are really important and one of the priority nutrients to ensure people get enough of, among others, um, gets really kind of mixed into that averaging. What would you say about maybe not considering all nutrients equally, but prioritizing? And if so, particularly in that question from a carbohydrate perspective, what are the nutrients that you say really important to get from carbohydrates because that's the unique source?
Okay, let me jump in here. So there is a basic point about nutrient profiling that I think, Barbara, you referred to at the very beginning. Nutrient profiling technically assesses nutrient density of foods, not healthfulness. Nutrient density per reference amount, and the amount can be 100 calories, 100 grams, or a serving. And you're absolutely right, it's a continuum. Every single nutrient profiling score is a continuum. The Nutri-Score, Health Star Rating, Food Compass, Nutrient Rich, those are continuous scores showing it's a progression from foods which are less healthy to foods which are more healthy, but never is there a line saying bad foods to the left, good foods to the right. We actually stayed away from that, exactly as you say, it's a continuum. And then nutrient profiles were developed to address a public health issue. And in rich countries, the public health issue was obesity and overweight and too many calories. So nutrient profiles developed in rich countries penalize calories, fat, sugar, and salt. But nutrient profiles are being developed in low and middle income countries are featuring high quality protein and fiber and shortfall vitamins and minerals, including iron and zinc and vitamin B12. So the purpose of nutrient profiling is to look at the nutrient needs of a given society. So when we come to carbohydrates, I would say there are a number of components. I think fiber and whole grains and free sugar are certainly three. You can also look at saturated fat, and then you can start looking at nutrients, which are sometimes added to foods, occur in processed foods, and which are still necessary for us. So I think that this is a very interesting way of looking at multiple contributions of carbohydrate foods to the diet. And I think nutrient profiling schemes, not a single one, several, can capture that.
Joanne, did you want to add anything?
I do. I really appreciate Dr. Drunowski. He invited one of my students to work with him because this is a whole different expertise of nutrient profiling. And it's kind of like going to war, because there's so much going, there's no right answer. So you're always, people are like, oh, you're not being fair. So thank you for inviting Julie Hess to work with you. And it's really opened up her career in ultra processed foods and being way of thinking in new ways. And I appreciate having younger people here. And I really appreciate that IFINS brings together government, university people, industry people to share, because we're not enemies. We all want the consumer to make better choices. So really appreciate you guys sponsoring it and bringing all this new talent into this area. Very exciting.
I agree. Very exciting.
I'll also say, Dr. I'll get one last comment in here for Dr. Drunowski. I think it's phenomenal. And, what you can have is population specific, even individual specific nutrient profiling systems based on their needs. There's no reason why we can't have that. We have all the tools we already need. It's really just coordinating and getting the information out to the people at the right time. So, I love
you are so right. And this is a discussion I had with the FDA about 10 years ago, because I said, if you have a handheld mobile and nutrient profile with augmented reality, it's healthy for you. And it does not come under FDA regulations because this is for you personally and you alone. I think this is the future. I think it can be AI assisted, and this is definitely the future.
So, question. We have our closing question, which is, what is your headline main point that you want attendees from this webinar to take away? I'm going to ask that you really try to keep it to 1 to 2 sentences to make it really simple. Try not to elaborate with a lot of explanation. Pretend you're writing a newspaper headline. So who would like to go first? Show of hands. Who would like to be the first to do their headline? Josh, go.
I got you, Barbara. Understanding food health can be complex. Embracing uncertainty and humility will accelerate our collaborative journey to figure it out together.
Super, thank you. Who's next?
I'll go next. I say that there's a place for high quality carbohydrates in high quality diets. I'm avoiding the term healthy, but let's call it healthy grains in healthy diets, without forgetting about the fruits and the vegetables and the potatoes and the pulses.
I'll go next. We need to change the negative perceptions of carbohydrate foods among consumers. And it's important to think about those larger messages and information alongside the individualized nutrition that we can obtain through new technology.
All right.
You're a closer, Joanne.
Okay, 10 apples a day keep the doctor away, but also potatoes, rice, pasta, peaches, chocolate milk, and orange juice, etc. do also. Enjoy.
Oh, I love that. Okay, super.
I do too.
We picked the right order. The joy is a great and perfect ending to our webinar. So, as we conclude this webinar, we have some people to thank. So, first, we're grateful to our expert speakers, Anne, Joanne, and Adam, for engaging with us on this journey. I also want to thank all of you who are participants, particularly those of you who submitted questions, and also comment that if we didn't get to your question, you are welcome to email me. I think I tried to reply to everyone and give you my email if that was the case. I also want to just say that we really are interested in taking these priorities forward. We did have a question about social media. That's not something that we generally do. We interact with scientists, but if someone has a great idea and they think this message needs to get out to them, I would just ask you to email us. I will just suggest you take my first initial and last name, Belial, at ifins.org, and great ideas on how to expand, amplify, build on this, you're welcome to send to me. On the other hand, if you would like to be on the IFINS mailing list for other events, simply go to our website and you'll find a way to follow on social media as well as sign up. So with that, thank you to everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Yeah.